What It Takes to Heal, How Transforming Ourselves Changes the World is such a good book. Prentis Hemphill is someone who does somatic mindfulness, embodiment. They have the Embodiment Institute, does a lot of work around, is it possible for us to have connection with each other in a deeper way? The little bits that I'm able to pull out and work with in these classes is just such a small portion of the book. I really highly recommend it, What It Takes to Heal. And the Embodiment Institute is something that they started that really works with how we can do this together. One of the things I really appreciate about Prentis's book is focus on individual healing as well as being together. The task is to weave a belonging between people who have never belonged to one another or who have forgotten what it is to accept and invite. We are already kin, whether we like it or not. So expanding our we literally means, from a nervous system and survival point of view, expanding our reach to include other people. So some of us with social anxiety have a very narrow group of people who we feel safe enough with to engage with and trust. Some people have a much wider circle. I think probably we all have experiences of sometimes I go more deeply into vulnerability and other times I don't feel quite comfortable with that. Looking at that on an individual level as well as on a survival for our society. So the work of belonging is to put aside the stories we tell. So not of difference, but of inherent and complete separation. So this separation is getting into what Brené Brown has written a lot about around dehumanizing. So it's not so much that someone's different from us, it's that we've labeled that difference as something that takes them outside of the realm of humanity. So I like to include some of these pictures just to see what our reaction is to them. I am not just like them, and I'm human still. Expanding our concept of we is not about erasing difference, but about redefining human to include all of us for who we are. So on the top, Neil Patrick Harris, many of us who are older remember Doogie Howser and many of the movies he's been in since. When you look at that family, it's a gay family, 2 men, 2 children. They're on a boat. They look pretty safe. So how do you feel when you look at that? Does anything happen in your nervous system? Is there any shift in your breathing? And then Alok Vaid Menon is someone who I love their writing, their perspective, their wisdom, and they're challenging when I look at, particularly the first picture. They often will dress very feminine and also with hair and a beard, and it's something that's not usually. I'm not appalled by it or I'm not disgusted by it. It's just, oh, that's something that's outside of what we usually see. So when we look at that image, some people would look at that and put them outside of humanity. Expanding our definition and our inclusion is bigger than who we feel comfortable with. In the end, who is more human than you or me that we should plead for acceptance into their version of humanity? So that's a really powerful question that Prentis asks in the book. White male, middle class, there are some standards, so-called, in our culture. And if we're not part of that, if we don't go along with that, then we're somehow on the outside. Neil Patrick Harris and their family are white, they're upper class, they're rich. And so do they feel safer? How do we define who's part of humanity? It's working with our nervous system. How can we stay present and notice when we're starting to put someone on the other side? So for me, I feel very comfortable with a gay or queer family, with a Alok who is non-binary. And that might not be something that somebody's experienced. Somebody might feel, all of us feel a little bit differently about. Some more images. Karamo Brown, that lovely empathetic therapist in Queer Eye. And then on the other side, there's David Lammy, who's a member of parliament in the UK. And he's part of 56 Black men who dressed in hoodies. You can follow that on Instagram. But it's a way to look at the stereotypes that people have. Black men in a hoodie has a lot of danger. Just the image of it creates a lot of danger for many of us. So looking at something that we know is a stereotype and we can relate to it, Like looking into David's eyes, I'm not seeing anything there to be afraid of. And yet, first glance, it's like we have that conditioning because of our culture. And then Wanda Sykes, many of us are familiar with her as a comic. And I deliberately chose a picture where she's not laughing or smiling. How much do we need to have people be like us? And if they're not, then what do we do with that? This is all about our nervous system. When we feel safe, we relax and we connect. And when we don't, we don't. In the work that I do, I talk a lot about neuroception, how our nervous system detects threat, and it's highly based on the past. So if in the past we've had personal experience, or when we're talking about stereotypes, more likely a lot of news images and different things that create a perception of threat with some people, create a perception of safety with others, which often is not really based on truth. So when we come, for instance, to our daily practice that we do every day, we sign on, we have a bunch of experiences of safety, of connection as well, because when we come together, we see each other. It's a very familiar group. And once you've been coming for a little while, then it becomes more familiar. So our nervous system then predicts that we're going to be safe. When we're in an unfamiliar experience or walking into a room of people, we don't know what's going to happen. And that's when we're susceptible to this. Our brain is going to do that negativity bias in worst case scenarios, but also we're going to use stereotypes because that's like a shorthand that the brain uses. It's not like we're ever able to stop that process. What we are able to do is put a pause in it so that we can notice how it is that we're assessing this. And we can have experiences of safety, expanding our we. We can have those experiences of safety with people that maybe we haven't had that with before. This double bind, though, is that when someone is anxious, so if we walk into a room and we're feeling anxious, people are going to be less likely to think of us as safe or experience us as safe because we're anxious. And our nervous systems are set up through how we've evolved that if one person, it used to be 20 or 30 or 50 people in the tribe, if one person was anxious about something, everyone was paying attention because there might have been danger. So we still have that, even though the danger has nothing to do with the present moment. So this is one of the challenges that we have in our nervous system. Once we get into that system of anxiety or hypervigilance or having to kind of calm ourselves, come back into presence, then we have the opportunity to work with that in a more realistic and accurate way. But this is what's always going on in the background. And this is a little cartoon. Hey, lady, you'd be prettier if you smiled. Living in a patriarchal culture where men often feel they have the right to comment on our bodies is really tough. As I'm older, I certainly don't have that happen very much anymore. We walk around with that not knowing if that's going to happen. And not all men do that. And we all need to look at our entitlement around different things. How can we see that we're affected by these stereotypes? I don't feel safe. So what am I going to do now? Well, it reduces our ability to connect. So this is another quote from Prentis. There is no chance that we can show up for each other if one or both of us is still somehow an object. Dehumanizing another does not make us safer. So let's sit with that for a moment. What does that feel like in your body? And there's many ways that we can feel objectified. What's your experience with that? And also notice if you're feeling any shame, distress at all. These are hard things to work with, and partly because often when we don't do something perfectly, we kind of go into that binary of good and bad, and we feel shame. Just to notice that's something that we're working with, we're aware of. Dehumanizing another is something we've probably all done to some extent for different reasons. I found myself dehumanizing Trump supporters and putting them all in a corner over there and saying, you're not safe for me. So there's a lot of different ways that that happens. And we probably all participated in that to some extent. I know I have. Practicing kinship. Kinship creates the abundance we need. There's almost nothing more profound or more terrifying than the simple act of reaching for each other. There is no real intimacy that does not begin with listening. Practicing kinship is looking into one another's faces. And when we do that, does it feel familiar? So that's part of what happens in the small breakout rooms is that we look into each other's faces. And we do this in person. It feels a little bit more terrifying, probably in person, than it does on Zoom. It's a bit more mammal body to mammal body. But this is what we're doing in our community here in these meetings that we have on Sunday, is that we're working with this sense of intimacy, of listening. We listen to ourselves through our somatic listening. We listen to each other. When we think about some of the ways that the United States is such an obvious, blatant example of this, but it happens everywhere. Some people are getting the goods and some people are being put into situations where we're not. The rise of the 1%, the really rich people, and the rise of people who are not able to really survive well financially. That's another example of how can we work together to create more abundance. And I see that here, when people are sharing things back and forth that doesn't involve money. When there's not a lot of money in a community, for instance, then we'll find that people do trade back and forth and that we create more abundance that way. That's not something that's part of our regular culture. And it happens in our brain. It happens in our nervous system. It happens in our mammal bodies. We need to be cared for and cared about and cared with. There's a link here to an interview that Prentis did with Kai Sheng Tom, who is a transgender woman. It's a really interesting, deep conversation about what it is to be different. So as we're looking into empathy, empathy is the embodied act of widening our sphere of care. Let's look at this sentence. I could have enough curiosity to consider what it meant to them, not just how I might react to it. I'm sure there's no one here who would, if you saw a trans person or a loc dressed in the way that they dress, if you saw them on the street, none of us here would go after them and hurt them. And some do. There's a real rise in violence against trans people and queer people, particularly in transgender people. How is it that we could broaden our sense of what is it like for them? What is it like for a loc when they walk down the street and somebody says something that creates fear? What's it like for people who have been put over there? Let's sit with that just for a moment. Can we sit with their experience? And coming back to the nervous system, it takes this kind of internal safety to be curious and to stay steady when we come back from the larger cultural back into our own relationships. Stay steady as a relationship opens itself to us and shows us things we didn't know. Empathy is listening with an open chest that allows us to understand. So much of this somatic work is allowing our body to be seen. So we see what's going on in our body. We're noticing when we're reacting in certain ways, when we're hardening up, when we're opening and softening. And then deliberately do a practice of, I'm deliberately opening my chest. I'm feeling soft. This is such a question. I have enough curiosity to consider what it meant to them, not just how I might react to it. That's something we could really work with over time. And see also, sometimes our capacity is going to be very great. And sometimes, if we're already feeling stressed or tired or not safe, our capacity is going to be less. This mechanism of how we open and how we close and how we can open more and do it as a practice is really the depth of what we're working with here. So let's sit with this as an inquiry. Who in the end is more human? Who gets to decide? Well, we have a certain dominant culture, and they've decided that white, male, middle class, not rocking the boat, that's who's acceptable. And then we have subcultures. And, in the queer subculture, it's different. than in the heteronormative culture. Let's just kind of sit with this. What is your sense? Do you reject that? Do you see it? This conditioning is so subtle and it's so pervasive. I choose to redefine humanity on terms bigger than my own reflection or my own comfort. People don't have to be just like me. I could appreciate the diversity of people's experience. I could be kind. I could be open hearted, practice connecting. What is their experience? What's my experience being excluded for whatever the reasons might be? I'm not right body size. I'm not rich. I'm not all of these things that we're not. But who are we? And how can we reach out and connect with people on something other than those surface things? Notice your breath, notice your body. Are you tensing up? What would happen if you were to soften your chest? Maybe bring to mind a certain person or an experience that generally creates some trepidation. And just for a moment, what would that be like to remember that experience or that person with your breath being even and smooth, your chest being soft? They're not actually here, so they're not actually a physical or social threat right at the moment. We're just sitting with this for a moment, an image of it or a memory of it. And maybe what is their experience like? I know what my side of the experience is. What might their side be? Whether we agree with it or not, this isn't about agreeing with it. Just to look, there are other things at play here other than my own comfort, my own way of thinking about this. And to commit to this ongoing mindfulness of what's happening in my own experience. How am I connecting or disconnecting from people who make me feel uneasy, who are different than I am? How can I include or expand my definition of we, of humanity, of who I'm interested in getting to know with an open heart, with connection?